There are moments that split your life in half. The before and the after. For me, it happened on a Tuesday night, ordinary, quiet, cruelly normal. The kind of night that should have ended with a drink and silence, not with fire and ruin. I remember the sound first, not of the fire itself, but of glass breaking. Then came the heat, the rush of smoke, the choking scream of the alarms that didn't matter anymore. By the time I stumbled outside coughing, half blind, everything I owned was already gone. My workshop, the one I'd spent a decade building, brick by brick, was a skeleton in flames. My life's work melting in front of me, piece by piece. And in the reflection of that inferno, I saw his face. Not in person, not yet, but in the memory that cut through the smoke. Ryan Cole. Ryan had been my business partner once. We started together, two nobodies with the same hunger to build something real. He was charisma and charm. I was detail and discipline. He could sell the dream, and I could make it work. Together, we built Cole and Mercer Innovations, a small design firm that grew faster than either of us expected. Within 3 years, we had clients across the country, awards, investors knocking on the door. And then, just as fast as it rose, everything cracked. He said it was creative differences, but it wasn't creativity he wanted, it was control. When I pushed back against his risky deals and backroom investors, he froze me out. Suddenly, my emails stopped getting replies. My name vanished from the company website. One morning, I walked into the office and found security waiting with a letter effective immediately. Your partnership is terminated. Ryan smiled when he handed it to me. I'll handle it from here, Nathan, he said. You'll thank me someday. That was 2 years ago. I rebuilt alone. Started small, in a rented warehouse, designing prototypes, consulting on projects he was too big to notice. Until that Tuesday night, when everything I built went up in flames. The fire department called it an electrical malfunction. But I knew better. 2 weeks earlier, Ryan had called me out of the blue. Said he wanted to talk, apologize, maybe. We met at a bar downtown. He looked successful, expensive watch, custom suit. That slit grin he always wore like a mask. I heard you're back in the game, he said, sipping whiskey. Trying, I replied. Good, competition keeps us sharp. He smiled, then leaned closer. But be careful, Nate. This city's full of people who'd love to see you burn again. He said it like a joke. But his eyes didn't laugh. The fire took more than my business. It took proof. Blueprints, contracts, patents, all destroyed. Everything that could show what I'd invented before he did. Because 2 weeks later, his company unveiled a new design at an industry expo. My design. Same structure. Same flaws. Same goddamn mistakes. He didn't just burn me down. He erased me. The world saw his name on my work. They called him a visionary again. And I was the ghost. I spent the next month living in ashes. Literally. Insurance stalled. My savings bled out. I slept on the floor of what used to be my office, surrounded by blackened metal and silence. Most people would have given up. But grief, when it festers long enough, turns into something sharper. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image of Ryan, smiling under the stage lights, basking in applause meant for me. And something in me hardened. I stopped mourning and started planning. The fire was meant to bury me, but it did the opposite. It burned away everything that kept me soft, my patience, my faith, my restraint. All that was left was precision. The first step was understanding how far he'd gone. I started watching him. Not in person. Not yet, I wasn't that reckless. But I had contacts. Old engineers, journalists, people who'd been pushed out by him just like me. One of them, a woman named Claire, used to work as his executive assistant. When I found her, she didn't look surprised to see me. I knew you'd come eventually, she said, lighting a cigarette. What did he promise you? I asked. She exhaled smoke, smiled bitterly. A future. Same as you. She showed me an internal email chain, confidential, encrypted, but she'd saved copies. Ryan had been moving company funds into offshore accounts. The same way he'd funneled my work into his name, he was now funneling his investors' money into his own. It wasn't business anymore. It was theft. Big, careful, perfectly timed theft. And I realized something. If I wanted to bring him down, I couldn't just expose him. People like Ryan don't fall to the truth. They fall to the illusion of truth. So I decided to give him one. I started showing up where he didn't expect me. Industry events, conferences. I shook hands with people he thought were loyal to him. I smiled. I listened. I planted seeds. Every rumor began small, a hint that Ryan's investors were getting nervous, that his deals weren't as clean as they looked. That maybe, just maybe, the golden boy was cracking. At first, nobody believed it. Then one investor pulled out of a deal. Then another. Ryan didn't notice the pattern yet, but I did. Revenge, I realized, isn't a single strike. It's a series of whispers that turn into a storm, and I had just started whispering. That night, I returned to what was left of my workshop. I sat in the dark, the air still thick with the smell of burned metal. On the table in front of me lay a printed photo of Ryan at his last press event, surrounded by cameras, that perfect smile frozen mid-laugh. I held the lighter in my hand. For a moment, I thought about burning the picture. Instead, I set it down and whispered to it, like a promise, "You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you. But you'll watch it happen." And when I turned off the light, I felt something I hadn't in years: control. Then one morning, an email from an anonymous source appeared in the inbox of an industry reporter I'd befriended months earlier. The email contained a single spreadsheet, vendor payments dates, and a single offshore address repeated enough to be noticed. The reporter wrote a careful, non-accusatory query that essentially asked Hartwell Dynamics for comment on vendor transparency. The piece would air into days. When the article published, it didn't explode. It insinuated. But insinuation has gravity. Investors hate ambiguity. Phone calls came. An uncomfortable board meeting was scheduled for Friday. Ryan's face, usually the steady marquee, flickered. He blamed incomplete data on the press. He barked orders to Darren to produce everything. Darren scrambled. Prio apologized publicly. The junior designers bit their nails in conference rooms. And Claire sent me a text that said, simply, "This is where it starts." I stared at my thumb hitting the screen. I could have stopped. I could have walked away and let a truth, finally, roll like thunder. But what would that have accomplished? Ryan would have scrounged up a story about misinterpretation. He'd rebuild on a new lie. He would have the benefit of a narrative that pardoned him. No, if a man had used my life as lumber for his stage, he deserved a fall that burned every beam he built. So, I leaned in. I scheduled another meeting with Darren and offered to help with the audit. I proposed a neutral third-party forensic review, one I'd recommended because it benefited the clients, not because I wanted to set a trap. And because people like him always accepted help when it glowed like a flashlight pointed at an exit, he accepted. When the auditors asked for logs, they found timestamps that tracked to my consultancy's desktop for approvals that weren't mine. They found a vendor file someone had mislabeled and left in a shared folder. They found a string of approvals that bore my digital signature but were uploaded from a workstation that, on paper, belonged to the head of operations. The pattern looked ugly, and if you traced it far enough, the thread led straight to Hartwell's inner accounting. Inside the office, panic turned into accusation. People asked each other questions they used to avoid. Ryan's speech became clipped. He began to circle himself like a shark in shallow water, fast, furious, dangerous. He lashed out in public and in private, trying to reclaim the narrative with headlines and charm, but charm is brittle under mathematics. By the time the board convened, they weren't just talking about AP or hiccup. They were talking about risk, fiduciary duty, and whether the company had been run with appropriate oversight. Ryan responded the way most predators do when the blinds are torn down. He denounced the whistleblower. He demanded loyalty. And he tried to brand the whole episode as the work of a disgruntled ex-partner trying to claw at relevance. He had no idea just how close the story had come to being exactly that, a disgruntled ex, and how many of the people in that room had tasted the ash of his ambition. When I left the building that day, someone saw me from across the street and raised a hand in what looked like either greeting or accusation. I kept walking. The city hummed, oblivious to the small war shuddering inside glass and chrome. Infiltration, I learned, is a slow kind of violence. It doesn't leave bruises you can point to. It leaves questions, and questions are corrosive in a world that trades on certainty. I had more questions for Ryan now than I had when I started. Not least among them, when the house fell, would I feel satisfaction, or only ruin, shared and universal? I didn't have the answer. I only had the plan. And for the first time since the night my workshop burned, I felt steady in the middle of the storm. Once you start pulling threads, the whole sweater wants to come undone at once. When the trade piece ran, and the auditors started sending polite but demanding requests, the office changed color. It went from bright to antiseptic of fluorescent lights, measured tones, people who smiled like they were starting to lose teeth. The small kindnesses that used to lubricate office life vanished. No more lunchtime jokes. No more late-night celebratory drinks. Instead there were calendars filled with red blocks and whispered strategy calls behind frosted glass. I remember the day things began to accelerate as vividly as I remember the first time Ryan smiled at me like a partner and not a puppet. He stood at the head of a conference room, hands pressed to the polished table like an animal trying to feel stability. He read from a prepared statement about transparency and cooperation. His voice sounded thin to practice to be convincing, and he kept looking at the window as if waiting for an outside signal that would tell him the world was still his. My role was easy and ugly at once. I was the person who could speak softly into people's doubts and guide them towards certain conclusions without ever shouting. I arranged quiet conversations with clients who'd been friendly to Ryan but who also cared very little for reputational risk. I sent private messages to lesser-known investors with spreadsheets that showed marginal irregularities in quarterly allocations, framed as observations rather than accusations. Nobody wanted to look like a conspiracy theorist. Everyone wanted to avoid being burned. My emails were polite, professional, and surgical. I watched how quickly fear becomes paperwork. Inside the company walls, the pressure created predators and prey where there had been colleagues. Darren, the procurement lead, went from annoyed to frantic. He started sleeping in his office, approving things with a tremor in his wrist. Priya, who had always smoothed rough edges with a lipstick smile, started to make calls at odd hours to legal counsel. Junior designers started mistaking me for a confidant they hadn't meant to trust, and in those moments their rawness made me feel guilty and fierce at once. How many people would I destroy to get one man to fall? The ledger kept growing. We'd anticipated a counterattack. Men like Ryan burn bridges and then build new ones fast. So I fashioned preemptive narratives, small, defensible excuses that would read like competence if he tried to spin them. We put together a media package that emphasized compliance, audits, independent reviews, governance restructures, and appearance of action that would pacify the board long enough for the truth to surface. The PR angle required patience, because optics are like tinder. You don't want the whole house blazing until the structure beneath it is weakened. We fed him the medicine that would mask fever but reveal infection under a microscope. Then the leak happened. It started as a whisper in an industry Slack and bloomed into a chain of emails that reached the right reporter's inbox. Someone at the messy vendor I'd scoped out, had been careless enough to CC a forwarding address that mapped to an offshore account. The spreadsheet contained dates, wires, and a handful of consulting fees that, when aggregated, were significant. The reporter called asking for comment. The board asked for an emergency review. A major client paused their campaign. Panic became a traffic jam. Ryan's reaction was what I'd expected: loud, insistent, theatrical, but this time the theater did no good. He tried to command loyalty. He tried to place blame on a phantom cyber attack. He called for loyalty and rallied his inner circle, pleading with them, brow furrowed, voice raw. But loyalty is a currency that spends quickly when future payoffs evaporate. The men who'd once laughed at the office holiday party suddenly had children's tuition payments on their minds. The calculus changed, and people who'd been complicit for a bonus suddenly wanted records and proof. The board requested access to everything. Not the stage summaries Ryan liked to circulate, but raw logs, server timestamps, approval chains. The auditors wanted to trace IPs, reconcile payments, and compare emails to approval signatures. When you rely on stories rather than receipts, the math strips away the lies. The thing that surprised me, in the worst possible way, was watching how hard people tried to believe him even while they betrayed him. Human beings are allergic to being wrong about people they've invested in. I saw it in Priya's eyes during a meeting. She wanted to believe his charm, because it would mean she hadn't been foolish. I saw it in Darren's knuckles as he retyped an approval number like a prayer. Those moments made my victory feel complicated, We were exposing something rotten, but we were gutting a small ecosystem of livelihoods along the way. The auditors found patterns. Wire transfers with vague descriptions. Consultants paid through shell companies months after their reported engagement had ended. Approvals time-stamped at hours when the approving manager was traveling. When they traced some of the payments, a few led to accounts where Ryan's signature appeared on the ledger. It was meticulous, boring work, the kind of work that leaves no room for the heroic story Ryan would have preferred. It stripped his choices down to numbers and timelines. And then the most dangerous thing happened. Ryan began to suspect someone close to him. He called an emergency meeting and spaced the seats in the boardroom so every face was visible and every phone was silent. He stood before us and said, "There is a person in this room who wants to see me fall. If you know anything, tell the board. If you are protecting someone, this will look worse." It was an appeal to tribalism and self-preservation. It was also a warning. You learn a kind of theater when you watch someone long enough. The gestures they use to hide fear, the jokes that paper over panic, the precise way they adjust their tie when they're lying. You learn the cue cards, the stage directions, and then you learn how to improvise a better scene. I needed to be someone Ryan trusted, or at least someone he didn't notice. So, I became the opposite of dramatic. I dressed blandly. I smiled in the right places. I answered emails promptly. I turned into the efficient shadow every executive loves and ignores. First, I rebuilt my paper trail. Not by forging things I shouldn't. There's an ugly difference between invention and crime, but by recreating plausible histories. A consulting LLC with a few legitimate-sounding clients. A LinkedIn profile polished enough to draw a glance. A portfolio that hinted at success without screaming threat. The idea was simple, be useful, not flashy. Be the man with an answer, not the man with the microphone. I started small and intentional. Casual reach out to a vendor. Ryan still used an email thanking them for their rapid turnaround on a project and praising their transparent invoicing. I copied everyone. A tiny thing, a soft entry. But people eavesdrop on flattery. The vendor responded. And because business is a network of favors, the message forwarded on to Ryan's operations manager, the one who handled procurement and hated surprises. That manager, whose name was Darren, had the kind of boredom that turns into curiosity quickly. He wrote back asking if my LLC might consult on a small compliance scrub they were too busy to do in-house. I said yes. The first meeting was hallmarked by politeness. I sat in a conference room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and ego. Darren talked about deadlines and monthly reconciliations. He showed me spreadsheets with half explanations. I nodded, asked the right questions, and left him thinking I was a godsend. Darren didn't know what he'd offered when he told the procurement group that we could bring a friendly consultant on for a few hours. He didn't know that my friendly consultant email had already been forwarded to Ryan's assistant, Claire, who liked to stack the inbox with useful toys. Claire was harder. She had the kind of eyes people think hide nothing to bright, too honest until you notice the way she composes the truth to suit herself. She met me with a black coffee, a notebook, and a poker face. "You worked with Ryan before?" she asked, pen poised. "I did," I said. "Long time." I kept my tone even. A man who sounds haunted is either dangerous or needy. I wanted neither. She studied me. "He'll trust you if you make him look good," she said, almost as if she were testing whether I wanted to be trusted or wanted to be useful. "He hates time sinks. I do results," I answered. "Fast, honest, whatever it takes." She laughed then, a brief release of air. "We need more people who do that and less people who talk." In the weeks that followed, I became the answer to tiny problems. I dressed down a vendor contract that was needlessly complex. I cleaned a messy invoice trail and presented it as a quarterly efficiency briefing. People like quick wins. They owe you favors for them. You can see the way an office's gratitude accumulates like interest. While I gained the trust of middle managers, I watched Ryan from a distance, his new routines, the cadence of his mornings, the people who always flanked him. He surrounded himself with a small court. Darren, who liked control disguised as numbers. Priya, head of client relations, who polished language until it shone. And to junior designers who did the work while he took the photos at ribbon-cuttings. The trick of infiltration is not to occupy power immediately, but to occupy relevance. I volunteered for logistics, a vendor audit, an overdue compliance update, a presentation for an anxious client. When offered a speaking slot at a minor industry panel, how small firms can vet partners, I accepted and used it to display knowledge that was helpful but not threatening. Ryan attended. He clapped politely and then posted a photo of us on social media, my face slightly shadowed beside his triumphant grin. He never introduced me as anything more than a consultant friend. That was perfect. The world saw me as a cipher, useful, complimented, but not a rival. Behind that neutral face, I was building dossiers. I copied server logs when I could, saved screenshots of email threads, and cataloged vendor routing. I photographed pay stubs left open on desktops, and I took note of whispered phrases: accelerate the round, offshore buffer, expedite approval. People are sloppy when they think no one is listening. They're reckless when they believe applause will cover the footprints. I also watched Ryan's vanity. Men like him are fragile under praise and reckless under flattery. He loved the press, the stage, the single-line quotes that made him sound prophetic. So we fed that hunger. My no relation to anyone, just a name I used for a small PR contact helped by passing him flattering profiles. He basked. He was a man rediscovering the music of his own applause, and the louder it played, the less careful he became. The deeper I got, the more complicated the ethics felt. There were moments when a junior designer confided in me how exhausted she was. Or when Claire handed me a folder with personal notes she'd taken in a meeting, stuff she didn't think anyone would read. Their trust weighed on me like a ledger. I told myself the ledger balanced, exposed the deceit, saved the many from the one. I told myself it was a simple moral equation. In the quiet of my rental apartment at night, though, that math sometimes blurred. Then came the first fracture I designed. I needed Ryan to choose speed over caution publicly. I needed him to make a move that made his fingerprints visible. So I fed him a prize, a Fox client lead that sounded like gold. An overseas startup, plausible, eager, desperate for a launch event in 90 days and anxious about partner reliability. I had the CEO's email ready, full of buzzwords: disruptive narrative, global PR push, flagship presence. Ryan loved the sound of it. He wanted the headline. He wanted to be the man who could launch a brand overnight. I arranged the meeting through Darren. Ryan arrived in a tailored suit, smile preloaded, and I watched how his hands moved when he sketched the future. He promised fast turnarounds, curated media, and staged testimonials. The startup rep and actor, coached by my own small network of freelancers, applauded his hustle. Ryan left with a handshake and a bravado that warmed the room. 2 weeks later, the fake startup's legal counsel again, a carefully selected freelancer, called a procurement meeting. The vendor needed to be expedited, contracts signed, overseas suppliers vetted. I nudged the process along, suggest the expedited clause, float the offshore subcontractor as a way to reduce overhead, emphasize the need for speed. It was subtle. It required no forgery on my part, only the right pressure on other people's worst instincts. The vendor we used was real. Competent but purposefully ill-documented, good at delivering one-off creative assets but sloppy on invoices, and poor at legal traceability. I'd vetted them to be just messy enough to create a trail that looked suspicious under forensic inspection without being criminally irrefutable in the moment. It was a calculated risk to manufacture a brittle bridge for him to step on when the vendor's first delivery lagged. Ryan's answer was to double down publicly. He announced the partnership in a celebratory post and asked the team to prioritize launch assets. Panic became a crowd pleaser for him. He'd rather pretend than verify. He pushed the team harder. Priya called in designers at midnight. Darren signed approvals with a sigh. The system bent until a seam showed. In the middle of that churn, Claire slipped me a message late one night. "Be careful," it read. Then a line: "He's been busy. He hides things in plain sight." She could have been warning me, or warning herself. Maybe both. I'd prepared for that. My next move was to create a plausible paper trail that tied funds to the vendor. Funds that would, when audited, reflect a suspicious routing. Not forged, simply rationalized. Invoices labeled as consultation, payments described as international processing fees, approvals archived in the wrong folder. When the auditors inevitably asked for timestamps and IP addresses, those little irregularities would read like error patterns. The kind auditors don't ignore. To the team, it looked like a tough quarter and brave leadership. To those who watched closely, the foundation trembled. To Ryan, it looked like inevitable momentum, the kind he had always equated with invincibility. But infiltration isn't only about logistics and spreadsheets. It's a psychological game. I began leaving small, defensible compliments that cut deeper than any insult. A well-placed observation in a meeting about a missed credit line made Ryan make eye contact with his manager and ask, for once, who had approved it. A sit-alone comment to a client about preferring dry, verifiable numbers over story made investors ask for raw data. Those nudges started the pattern: confidence replaced by verification, applause replaced by paperwork. Every time Ryan reacted, it told me where his blind spots were. Every flinch was a map. I kept folding the map into my pocket. The deep cut had been delivered. It bled into boardrooms and courtrooms and family kitchens. People were choosing sides, changing careers, mourning futures. The thing I'd wanted to expose a thief was unfolding with all the collateral damage I'd feared. I had pushed the world to account, but the world accounted with a ledger that included many names. And in that ledger, my own entry was ambiguous: hero, saboteur, wounded man. The line between them thinned each day. There was only one thing left that could make the fall complete and, more importantly, irreversible: incontrovertible proof that tied the fraud not to rumors or appearances but to documents and signatures that would survive spend payments, approvals. A paper trail that even the most expensive lawyer couldn't erase without tracing their client's fingerprints. I started preparing for that final hand. It would be public, ugly, and absolute. It would leave nothing for him to spin into a martyr's tale. It would cost me more than I anticipated. But by then the choice had sealed itself: finish it, or watch the man who burned me walk out of the smoke unscathed. So I sharpened my resolve and braced for the last strike. The unmasking was coming, and with it a reckoning that would decide not just Ryan's future, but mine as well. They told me revenge would be clean if I planned it long enough. They lied. There is no clean with fire, only ash that scatters and lands on people who never asked for heat. The day the regulator's report hit the wire, the world seemed to tilt on a hinge. Headlines used words like scheme, self-dealing, breach, and a dozen reporters who'd once fawned over Ryan now repeated the language of ledger and law. The headlines were clinical. The damage was anatomical. People read the story in coffee breaks and elevators and in living rooms where spouses frowned and asked whether their partner should be worried about their 401k. I watched it all from a seat in a tiny room with no windows. The kind of space lawyers use when they want you to feel like the world has narrowed to a single file folder. My counsel sat across from me, hands folded, thumbs tapping a rhythm that was oddly comforting. We'd spent months building the packet: Claire's preserved emails, the ex-accountant's sworn statement, time-stamped drafts, wire transfers that curved from company accounts to shell entities, and finally to private pockets. We preserved chain of custody notes for every scrap. Because the law is a merciless arithmetic: evidence plus provenance equals truth. The lawyers called it forensic closure. I called it an answering. Outside, Hartwell's stock trembled. Investors called emergency meetings. The board moved faster than I imagined. A bunch of polite, wealthy people could suspensions, freezes, public statements that said the right things in well-practiced tones. Ryan issued his own video of contrition wrapped in obfuscation, but the documents we'd put in front of regulators spoke with a clarity his performance couldn't cut through. The accounts bore his initials. The approvals bore a pattern of authorization that could be tracked across systems. The shell entities led to addresses and intermediaries and, ultimately, to people whose complacency had been bought with money they thought would never need explaining. He was not arrested that week. There are processes, appeals, and the legal world moves in steps that are often cruel in their slowness. But within 48 hours his name stopped being a magnet for journalists wanting a soundbite and turned into a subject for compliance officers and forensic analysts. The man who once consumed rooms with noise now swallowed words advised by counsel. When the press came to my building, I declined. I didn't want a stage. I wanted the record. I'd learned the hard way that cameras and justice are different animals. Cameras want drama. Courts want receipts. I let the receipts do their work. Word reached me that morning that a key investor had filed to claw back funds. Another client froze a contract. Board members called for executive changes. Hartwell's PR people offered statements that tried to reframe the narrative. We are committed to transparency. They used we a lot, plural, collective, as if it could hide individual culpability. But when a company's language becomes our speak, there hides the one who set the fire. Ryan tried last moves. He leaked selective emails to sympathetic outlets. He threatened countersuits. He sought to manufacture doubt by pointing at my old failures, my bankruptcy filings after the fire, the rawness of a man who had been crushed. But you can only point fingers so long before you run out of hands. The evidence held. The paper trail was stubborn. His improvisations sounded brittle under the weight of timestamps. For days I felt a curious, hollow pressure in my chest. The satisfaction people assume revenge yields did arrive a sharp, bright hit when a headline named his account as a conduit. But it was thin. It didn't fill me. Instead, it rearranged the ache. The victory had an aftertaste, not of triumph, but of recognition. I had engineered outcomes. I had become competent at a dark craft. Competence is power. Power asks for a price. The board convened an emergency meeting. Cameras were not allowed. The company's counsel read dry minutes. Ryan was asked to step down for cause. He refused and then, and characteristically, left. He walked past people who would not meet his eye. He carried himself like a man whose clothes had been stripped of their adornment. The suit was still on his back, but the person beneath it had been unstitched. I didn't attend his exit. I watched the footage later, because it felt like watching a mirror of the night my workshop burned, the same easy faces now folding like paper. There were no fireworks, no cinematic collapse. There was paperwork and the slow rustle of legalese. The end suited them, tidy on paper, messy in life. Then, the investigation broadened. Regulators asked for testimony. Auditors subpoenaed servers. I was deposed once, twice. An array of questions that sometimes felt like cross-section surgery. Where were you on this date? Who sent that email? Why did you archive this file? I answered with truth and with the police's calm voice I had learned to adopt. I'd prepared for this. I had to be better than him at the thing he once exploited. In the months that followed, Hartwell paid fines. The company restructured. Ryan's name started to drop from commentary, replaced by phrases like former leadership. A few people lost their jobs. Some families suffered. I heard that Morrow left the industry for a year and then started teaching. Tomas moved to a new city and began over. Claire, with eyes that had cradled too much, left the corporate world and became a paralegal, helping other whistleblowers find footing. Their lives were not restored by my actions, but at least some small, moral axis had shifted. And Ryan? I don't know the whole story, and maybe I never will. There were rumors of settlements, of quiet payments in exchange for silence, and whispers that he'd fled the country briefly before returning to a quieter life out of the spotlight. Some say he lost everything. Some say he kept enough. The law does not always bend in a neat arc. One night he called. We met where we'd met when we were partners, a bar that smelled of old beer and cheaper whiskey. The kind of place where people pretend their choices are simpler than they are. He looked older. He looked like somebody who had learned the cost of performance. You got me, he said, the words rounded and small. You did what you came to do. And I asked. And I'm tired, he said. I'm tired of the theater. The money doesn't look the same anymore. He gave a half laugh that sounded like something between apology and threat. Do you feel better? I thought about the charred wood of my old workshop. The nights I slept under fluorescent hum. The way my mother's hands shook when she wrapped the bandage around my wrist after I'd cut it building a prototype. I thought about the junior designer's face when he left the office with a cardboard box. I thought about Claire's quiet courage. No, I said. Not better. Different. That was the truth. Different. The shape of my life had shifted, but not in a way that filled the hole. I had exchanged being erased by someone else for the labor of erasing him, a trade that left me with scars authored by my own hands. In the months that followed I rebuilt, but not the way I once had. I didn't chase the industry's bright lights. I started small consultancies that specialized in compliance and ethics, the sort of work that turns what I learned into a shield for others. I testified at hearings. I helped create protocols that made some of Ryan's moves harder to replicate. It felt like a public penance of sorts. Use the tools you learned to protect other people from becoming ash. People asked whether I would ever forgive. Forgiveness is a private thing. What I did know was this: the kind of man I'd become to finish this fight was not identical to the man who'd been burned, but he carried the same gravity. I had to decide, every morning, not to let that gravity be the center of my life. One afternoon, long after the cameras and the storm had faded, I packed the last box of my old life for prototypes, patents registered anew, a few photographs I'd salvaged, and drove out of the city to the place where my workshop used to stand. The plot where flame had eaten wood was now a fenced lot with new gravel. I stood at the chain link and thought of promises, of the lighter I'd once held over a photograph, of the photo I'd never burned. Did Eve? I started. She looked away. There are things even I didn't know, she swallowed, but I found something while archiving Ryan's calendar entries for the audit. There's an email thread, not the big stuff, but a side chat where he instructs someone to clean a drive before a board review. He used the word burn. I flagged it. I wanted to grab her, to shake the name into her until she believed how small comfort she was offering. Instead, I kept my voice soft. Can you hand it over? No. Her answer was plain. I can't. If I do, I'm finished. I lose everything. She looked at me like she was choosing between a bone for a dog and a future for herself. But I'll help in other ways. She did, quietly. She became the canal through which tiny, useful streams of truth drifted outwards. Personnel memos, a timestamp here, an inconsistent vendor name there. She never gave the smoking gun outright because she was too frightened to be the one who lit it, but she fed the people who could interpret it: reporters, auditors, responsible counsel. It was all slow and legal and infuriating. And in those slow increments the case grew fat enough to survive counters. Meanwhile, Hartwell's team grew more reckless. There were ransom-like legal letters delivered to a journalist who'd run an innocuous piece, threatening a suit for defamation. There was an attempt to subpoena a private analyst's emails on spurious grounds, a move meant to intimidate anyone who might speak. People who liked the comfort of plausible deniability started to stonewall. The office was a field of mines, and I walked it with a map I'd drawn in sleepless nights. One morning, my mother stopped answering her phone. Panic ran cold through my blood. I drove to her house, heart thudding, and found a note pushed under the door, a typed message, couriered with polite language that tasted like a threat. Please stay out of Hartwell matters. For your safety. The note didn't scream. It whispered a precise threat into the quiet of domesticity. It said, you are a nuisance enough to be contained. I went to sleep that night with my hands clenched around the edge of the mattress, a child holding onto the only thing he could still control. The world I'd made into a ledger was suddenly full of human lives. My metrics had faces. For the first time, the satisfaction had a cost I hadn't priced. It changed what I was willing to do. Up until then, my actions had been surgical: documents, whispers, legal channels. But desperation bends rules. I realized the only way to make the fall irreversible was to stitch together a narrative so complete that even the most expensive PR machine couldn't stitch it back. I had to make financial and forensic facts meet in a way that left no room for plausible spin. The auditors would do the math. The press would do the framing. The courts would do the rest. But the auditors needed permission to dig deeper. And that permission came from the board, and the board would not act until a major investor threatened to pull out. So I engineered that threat. No, I didn't hack accounts or fabricate wires. The plan relied on legal, public channels and on people who would no longer look the other way once the money was on the table. I spent nights on calls with a new kind of ally: disgruntled minor investors, an ex-accountant who'd left Hartwell early, a compliance officer, a client who'd grown suspicious. I arranged meetings and shared precisely the documents I'd been collecting, enough to show pattern, not enough to risk perjury. The goal was not to lie. The goal was to let truth sit where it would hurt most. An investor agreed to call board member privately and ask, bluntly, are you comfortable exposing the firm to this risk? The call was a pivot point. Board members have thresholds. That conversation nudged them beyond theirs. The moment it happened was anticlimactic and ugly. An executive from Falcor, one of Hartwell's key backers, sent a terse email asking for emergency governance measures. The board convened, counsel briefed, and the auditors were told they could escalate. The room felt like a pressure cooker with a simmering valve. Once the valve opened, the audit's demands were surgical: full access to transaction records, staff interviews, and, crucially, an external forensic accounting firm. For one hungry week, everything that had been hidden in plain sight was requested in writing. The investigators were competent, slow, and relentless. They found payments rooted in odd patterns, consulting fees that linked to shell addresses, and approvals that bore the digital fingerprints of people who'd since claimed ignorance. They found, too, a pattern of edits, drafts altered to weaken attribution, files overwritten in the weeks after my termination. The evidence was not a smoking gun that screamed fraud in the headlines, it was a rope of small knots that, when pulled together, became a noose. Ryan tried moves of theater, a public interview where he painted himself as wounded but committed, an op-ed about building responsibly, even an offer to step aside temporarily while things were sorted. But the board had smelled the money slipping. Fiduciary duty is a blunt instrument when investors' capital is at stake. He was suspended later. As the investigation deepened, the board asked him to resign. He resisted for a while, loud and bitter, but when law and money point together, performance crumbles. The board's decision, however justified, didn't feel like justice. It felt bureaucratic. They painted it as protection for stakeholders. They framed it in minutes and bullet points. Ryan's nameplate was removed, and the office that had once applauded his jokes rearranged itself. Under new leadership, people exhaled and then buried their faces in hands. Hartwell shuffled executives like a deck of cards. Then came the quiet war's most vicious turn. Someone inside the firm, I never learned who, tried to pin the leaks on me. A paper trail surfaced, conveniently incomplete, that suggested my consultancy had been given privileged access months after my termination. The trail insinuated that I'd used that access to plant evidence. The smear was elegant in its simplicity, make the whistleblower look like the saboteur. It spread in emails and legal notes. In the private chatter of boardroom confidences, my name, which had been a quiet shield of anonymity in some circles, now rang in meetings like an accusation. For a while, I considered walking away. Not because I feared consequence, though I did, but because the work no longer felt like saving my life and more like mirroring the thing that had taken it from me. I was perilously close to becoming the same pattern, clever, vindictive, and willing to sacrifice others to prove a point. But when I thought of the smoke, the charred prototypes, my mother's note, the theft of my ideas, I felt a stubborn, old ember flare to life. If I walked away, Ryan would rebuild or hire a smoother operator. The industry would still reward predators. I had to finish this, not to gloat, but to stop the machine he'd built. So I pivoted. I hired counsel, a firm that specialized in whistleblower protections and corporate fraud. I compiled a legal packet, chain of custody notes, timestamps, corroborated testimony from Claire and the ex-accountant, copies of emails and archived drafts that showed the edits. Everything was framed for legal consumption, not tabloid mouths. I filed a protected disclosure with the regulator and handed an identical, redacted packet to the journalist who had been persistent and careful from the beginning. The consequences came fast. Once regulators were engaged, the firm's insurance advisors grew vocal about exposure. Auditors widened their lens. The board installed a special committee. Litigation herds arrived at class action whispers. Client counsel asking for restitution, investors demanding audits. In the middle of that chaos, Ryan retreated to the one place where men like him recalibrate, his public statement. He released a carefully crafted video that tried to summon contrition and deflection at once. I've made mistakes, he said, voice taut, but I love this company and I will cooperate fully. The video wanted pity. The video wanted narrative control. The video failed in a way I had come to expect. The things his voice tried to smooth were now in files and wires and emails that didn't care how he performed. Days later, at a hearing room that smelled like new carpet and nervous cologne, government official read preliminary findings, irregularities consistent with self-dealing and misclassification of expenses. The language was sober, implacable. It didn't promise criminality yet, but it promised more attention. Papers rustled like falling leaves. And then, unexpectedly, Ryan called me. We met in the same downtown bar where he'd once smiled and promised me futures. He sat across from me, hands wrapped around a coffee that had gone cold. You went too far, he said, meaning it as accusation and admission both. You stole everything from me, I replied. You burned alive. He shook his head slowly, the old charm gone. I didn't mean for it to go like this. It got out of control. Investors, pressure, you know how it is. He looked tired in a way that made the envy in me dull. They'll try to scapegoat you. You should be careful. His warning was almost fatherly. It stung because it was true in part. People were looking at me with new suspicion, but I'd done the math on what I'd given to this fight. I had no intention of being boxed into a narrative he'd designed. The bar's neon light flickered. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. Inside, we both sat with the knowledge that the next moves would be ugly and irreversible. He left first. A man heading into a room that would probably be full of lawyers and quiet goodbyes. I watched him go and felt no triumph. I felt exhaustion like a weight. That night, as people filtered out, he stopped by my desk. He didn't speak loudly. He just placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt heavier than his threats had been. "Alex," he said, his voice low, "you were always good with details. Help me find the mistake. Help me find the person tearing us apart." His eyes searched mine for the thing who could save him. In that instant, I felt the old temptation to step forward and play the man who forgives, the one who fixes what he broke. To show him what loyalty once was and perhaps be welcomed back into the warmth I'd been pushed from. For the tiniest fraction of a heartbeat, I almost wanted that. I almost wanted to be the man who patched a wound he didn't deserve to have patched. But then I thought of the smell of melted plastic and the photograph of my charred prototypes, the way his face had been lit on a stage with my ideas applauded under his name. I thought of what he told me when he handed me the termination letter. "You'll thank me someday," I felt, with a clarity that was crystalline and cold, that there was no returning to that warmth without becoming complicit again. I let his hand fall away like a stone in water. "Have you checked the offshore subcontracts?" I asked instead, because the language of help could also be the language of exposure. There were a few contracts filed in error. "I can pull them for you." He nodded, but his smile had thinned into something smaller, fear masked as command. "Do that," he said, "and find whoever's leaking." He left, shoulders hunched. The room felt quieter after that, like the world had inhaled and decided to hold its breath. The board met the next morning and the mood shifted from debate to inevitability. The finance committee had the auditor's preliminary report, and it was ugly. They asked for Ryan's resignation, at least temporarily, pending further inquiry. He fought like a cornered animal, vociferous, theatrical, but the board was no longer an audience. They were fiduciaries balancing risk. They'd watched the numbers. They'd watched investors twitch. Their loyalty had an expiration date when their fiduciary duty was at stake. When the motion to suspend him passed, Ryan's face imploded. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He stared, like someone watching a bridge collapse in slow motion. He turned toward me as if to say something Ryan final, maybe a plea, maybe an accusation, but the words stayed behind his teeth. He walked away with his head down, escorted to a car that looked too small for a man who used to command rooms. People whispered as he left. Some clapped softly. Some cried quietly in the washroom. The office exhaled, and in that exhale was a sound I hadn't expected at all: relief, but also the low, frightened pity of people who realize that victory has a cost. There was celebration in some corners, barely concealed. A few colleagues came to me with hugs and glasses of scotch, saying things like, "You did the right thing." I accepted their thanks with a hand that refused to tremble. I felt the thin, bright ripple of satisfaction, then the wash of guilt and the taste of ash. Because even as the board moved, evidence collected, and Ryan's empire began to feel like a house with its supports removed. There was a countercurrent. The company was bruised and vulnerable, and vulnerability draws vultures. Rumors of buyouts circulated. Competitors called like vultures. Products were delayed. People lost contracts. The cascade I had started to stop one man's theft had become its own catastrophe. And worst of all, a rumor began to snake back toward me. Subtle at first, a raised eyebrow in a meeting, a question asked in a tone that implied knowledge, and then sharper, office gossip tied my name to the timing of approvals. Someone mentioned my consultancy in the same breath as the careful approvals that had my signature. A whisper that began with the words "maybe" he curled into a thread someone on the executive team would have to consider. I caught myself looking at my hands as if they were made of something unfamiliar. Were they the tools that built my life, or the instruments I used to tear another's down? The thought unsettled me. I hadn't wanted to become a mirror of what I hated. I'd wanted justice, not replication. Yet the methods I'd used, seeding suspicion, manufacturing narratives, manipulating people, were the same tactics he'd leaned on to bulldoze over me. That night I sat on the roof of the building that used to house my workshop and watched the city pulse. The lights looked the same, indifferent and endless. Below, Hartwell Dynamics hummed, lights in the boardroom, a security guard making rounds, the small anonymous tasks that make companies breathe. Above, the stars were cold and many. Claire texted me. They asked about you. Keep your head down. Her briefness felt like both warning and confession. I closed my eyes and thought of firelight reflected in Ryan's face, and then thought of the boardroom where his nameplate had been removed. The world had shifted. People had been exposed. Some would recover. Some would not. And whatever came next, lawsuits, settlements, possibly criminal probes, would be messy and public. I had wanted him to watch as he fell. He would watch. But as the dust began to settle, the clarity I'd thought would wash pain away didn't. It just rearranged the hurt. In the hollow where my anger had lived, there was now a gnawing question. What had I become to dismantle him? And if I had to answer that question, would the answer still satisfy the need that had driven me from the start? There are moments when justice feels like redemption, and moments when it feels like theft dressed up as fairness. That night, under indifferent stars, I couldn't tell which it would be. All I had was the knowledge that the unraveling had started, and the worst part of any falling is that the pieces cut everyone who reaches for them. By the time the board voted to suspend him, the room had the smell of old coffee and new regret. That smell followed me home like a shadow. You'd think the hard part was done, that once a man like Ryan was publicly diminished, the rest would be paperwork and press statements. But collapse doesn't come with a tidy epilogue. It comes with noise, lawyers, cameras, furious emails, and the quiet, spreading damage to people who never asked to be in the theater. The first days were surgical. Auditors wanted every log, every stamped approval, every receipt. Regulators asked for interviews. Clients demanded assurances. Hartwell's legal team was efficient and practiced, all polite letters and composed press releases. Ryan's PR people spun platitudes about transparency while his private counsel told him to say as little as possible. He listened like a man in a play who'd forgotten his lines, and Ryan fought not violently, but with the resourcefulness of someone used to getting his way. He launched counters, claims of industrial espionage, instead of vindictive acts trying to rebuild relevance. It was a familiar playbook: gaslight, redirect, human smoke. The company's rhythm turned from expansion to survival. Floors that once celebrated launches now held strategy sessions on how to keep clients who smelled instability. The more he pushed back, the more I saw the true cost. Mara, who'd stood in my corner, was put on investigatory leave while the legal team clarified roles. Tomas, the junior designer who trusted me with drafts, was pulled into interviews so often he started answering his mother's calls with false cheer. Claire stopped coming to casual lunches. When I saw her at her desk, she looked 10 years older. People lost their health in small, silent ways: missed dinners, forgotten birthdays, frayed tempers. The truth I wanted to reveal ate them as collateral. Then, darker things began to happen. An anonymous smear piece surfaced online, thinly veiled and venomous, implying my consultancy was a front. The story stitched together half-truths and miscontextualized emails. It landed in the inboxes of 2 investors, and one of them, nervous and risk-averse, quietly froze a tranche of funding. Someone had found an old freelance blog post of mine, dug through a year-old forum comment, and turned curiosity into evidence of motive. Whoever arranged it knew the right places to jab. I had expected counterattacks. I hadn't expected the one that threatened the people I loved. 2 nights later, my sister called me in tears. Her voice was small through the phone. "They were at Mom's house," she said. "2 men asking questions about you. They said they were from Hartwell Security." Mom was frightened. Her breath hitched. "They left a card with a lawyer's number. They said to tell you to stop, or else. Threats dressed up as courtesy are the most poisonous. They're not made to make you back down, they're made to make you feel alone." For the first time since the fire, fear clawed up past patience and lodged in my throat. I called Claire the next morning and asked to meet. We sat in a corner cafe where the light slanted across chipped wood and anonymous cups. She stirred a coffee she didn't drink, eyes darting. "They're pinning things on you," she said. "They've been trying to shift focus. Ryan's been desperate." Our fingers trembled on the cup. "He thinks if he makes you look messy, he buys sympathy." I walked to the river that ran behind the lot. The current moved without care, indifferent and patient. I opened my hand and let the photograph Ryan under the stage lights, his smile still somehow arrogant in the print, slip into the water. It spun and vanished. The river didn't know revenge. It only knew flow. When it was gone, the thrill that had been sharpening inside me for years dulled. It didn't die. It thinned. The edge softened into a long, low ache that felt more like truth than victory. Years later, people still ask about Hartwell and lessons to be taught in business classes. Case studies in governance seminars, a cautionary tale. I get calls from entrepreneurs who want to protect their IP. I consult, testify, counsel. My name shows up in articles as the man who exposed a fraud. Sometimes it reads like praise. Sometimes it reads like a question. If you asked me now whether I would do it again, whether I would trade those 2 years of rage and patience for the life that had been, I'd say something complicated, that I'm grateful the theft was stopped, that I regret the damage done to collateral lives, and that revenge taught me a lesson I didn't want to learn the hard way. Power doesn't just corrupt, it reproduces. On a cold morning, years after the fire, I sat across from my mother at her kitchen table. She poured tea the way she always did and placed the cup before me. "You look like you've grown a little older inside," she said, not unkindly. "Did it fix things?" I looked at her hands, which had not changed, and then at my own. "It fixed some things," I said. "It broke some too. But mostly, it taught me which fights to fight." She nodded, as if that answer made sense. Outside, the city was already starting its day. People rushed, cafes opened, and the ordinary cruelty of time continued. I walked home, shoulders a little straighter, they present but not driving me. The river had taken one photograph. Everything else I carried with me, lessons heavy as tools. I would spend the rest of my life trying to use them for repair rather than ruin. And in that quieter life, a life of small ethics and steadier work, I found, not peace, but a kind of truce. The ash that once filled my mouth no longer tasted like victory. It tasted like a warning.